So the first question is, how did you meet Mr. Raines?
Friend in another business that called me and told me that he was looking for a girl. Well, I went in and sat down in front of his desk, and he says, what kind of a job are you looking for? And I said, well, a secretarial job. And I told him where I had worked before, and which was Walter's Drilling Company, and experience. And I told him I was the fastest typist in the city of Wichita. And have you meet my son, Gerald, and the geologist about the interview. I got up to leave, and he said, well, I'd like for you to come back on Monday to meet Gerald and Dawn. And so I said, okay, I'll be back on Monday. And I got up to walk out of his office, and he said, wait just a minute. He said, could you just come to work on Monday? And I said, oh, sure, I could do that. So he said, well, you can meet them when you're sitting out there at the desk. And so I said, okay. And oh boy, I walked out and I woohoo! I got a job.
Everything ready. Tell me a little bit about Mr. Raines. What was he like? What was Mr. Raines like?
A friend of his called him the Sly Fox because he listened to what other people said more than he talked. He was very knowledgeable, hardworking.
How did he get into the oil business?
His best friend had a filling station on East Douglas, and he began to talk to the people that stopped there, the men that stopped there on their way downtown, to ask them what they did for a living. And some of them were doctors, some were lawyers, and the biggest majority of them were in the oil business. So him and his friend that had the filling station across the street from him, they got together and decided that they would quit selling gasoline and that they would start buying oil and gas leases. He was very knowledgeable of the oil business. He was very quiet. He was not boisterous in any way. Great person to work for. And
have any idea when Mr. Raines would so-called have hit it big? In other words, where he, went.
Well, when he and his partner decided, after learning all these black cars going downtown and finding out what they did for a living, and it was mostly people in the oil business, men. And so they decided to close their filling station and go to, I think it was Michigan, either Michigan or I believe it was. And they set up a little office thing in the bank there in Michigan. And the bank allowed them to do that. And the people came in there, and they owned land, and so they got oil and gas leases from those people at $1 an acre. And they made they made so much money in just a short, like a week, maybe less, that they went back home to Wichita, and they bought a rig to drill wells.
Now, were they buying leases for other companies?
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And they bought leases for other companies, yes. And they made, like, I can't remember exactly, but it was so much money that they didn't know what to do with it. And it was, so they decided to buy a rig and start drilling wells. And they didn't know anything about drilling wells, but that's what they did. And
How did they decide where to drill? That Mr. Raines' business peaked after you went to work for him, or had his business already peaked before you started?
Oh no, actually he was, and I don't know if I should say this or not, but he came in to me just maybe a couple weeks after he hired me and told me that he was broke. And I thought, oh my goodness, and I need a job. But I went to, he said he was broke and he was going to have to close the office. And I said, well, how much money do you need? And he said, well, at least $300,000. So I happened to know a person that had that kind of money, because he was he wasn't in the oil business, but I don't know where he got all of his money, but he was connected with Bob Walters.
Was that Bartlett?
Yeah, Bill Bartlett. And I told Mr. Raines that I thought I knew somebody that could help him. And I said, if you'll allow me, because it was stressful times for me. And so I went over, talked to Mr. Bartlett, and he said, well, he said, if I wasn't so old, I would back Wilson right now. So he said, I'm going to ask you go back to your office and tell Mr. Raines to call, I can't think of his name. I just said it the other.
Banker?
Yeah, the banker over at the Fourth National Bank, and tell him the story and see if he would loan him the money. And so I contacted the banker, and I'll think of his name in a minute. And when I went over there, he said, he said, I can't help you, but I know somebody that could. And so that's when he introduced me to Mr. Bartlett. And so I went over and talked to him again, and no, that wasn't the way it went. Bartlett sent me to the banker, and the banker talked to Mr. Raines, because he called him, and so then the banker sent one of his people that worked for the bank, contacted me to get together all of the assets that Wilson Raines had in the oil business. And so I worked, not that it's about me, but for about 2 or 3 nights, because we were so close to Christmas. And I gathered up all of the pertinent information that the bank needed in order to make a loan. And so on the 15th day of December, the bank called Mr. Raines and told him that they were approving the loan for $300,000. And boy, was that ever a happy day for Wilson Raines. So, to tell you what kind of person Mr. Raines was to work for, the first thing he wanted to do was to give everybody a Christmas bonus. So he put me to work writing the checks for the, and so then Don Shaver and Dave Callowert put together a big play in
And to relax your arm.
the northwest part of the state, up in Russell County, and another one in Dickinson County, near Salina.
Mm-hmm.
And they had like 1,000 acres to lease, maybe even more than that. And he came in my office and told me that he was going to hire a person to go buy oil and gas leases, and his son Gerald was the lease broker that would buy leases, but he couldn't do it all by himself. So I said, well, why don't you let me do that? And and I said, I don't know how to do it, but I can learn. And so we had a map, and we drew a line right through the middle of it, and Gerald was on one side and I was on the other side. And together we got all of the acreage leased, and then we began to drill the wells. And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was probably in the 90s.
I remember it was because Mr. Raines celebrated because of him and his friend Albert Abercrombie and their wives went on a cruise. And we kept the business running while they were gone for 2 weeks. And everybody was happy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But what made you decide to want to buy the company?
Oh, because his kids wanted to sell the company to somebody. And I was in the attorney's office at the time, and I said, well, why don't you let me buy it? And he said, of course, I didn't have any money to buy it, but I knew I could get it through the bank. And so he talked to the Raines children, and they said, well, have her make us an offer. And so my attorney came back to me, and he said, they're willing to take an offer. So I said, oh gosh, I have no idea of how much it's really worth. And I said, I said like $500,000. And he said, well, if you paid them $500,000, I wouldn't want to be your attorney. I remember that so close. And I said, well, then I'll say $300,000. And he said, well, now that's more like it.
But you settled anyway on an amount.
So there I was in the same predicament Mr. Raines was, going to the bank to borrow the money to buy the company.
But you did.
And that worked out okay.
Yeah.
And
Still not high.
that's how I became the owner. And we paid the kids off their money, and they were happy, and they were leaving me alone, and the rest
Okay.
But the bad part was that our accountant that was working there, he up and quit. And it got down to Pat and me.
Mm-hmm.
And I went back there and I told her, how would you like to be an accountant? And she said, I don't know anything about it. And I said, well, you can learn. Same way I got treated, you can learn.
Mm-hmm.
And she did. And here we are today.
Okay.
And I have fired the field superintendent because he was stealing from the company.
Oh, well, whatever.
Well, it's true, he was.
He's
But
dead now, though, so.
No, he's not. In fact, he called me not too long ago.
Who's that?